It's all smoke and mirrors.
Never falter.
Surprised to see me?
Shut down.
Patience, summoner.
Peace.
There's no escape. Where?
An ally has been slain. Has destroyed a turret. Your turret has been destroyed.
Looks can be deceiving.
Peace. Never falter.
Good eye.
An ally has been slain.
Trust me.
An ally has been slain.
Peace.
It's all.
Never falter. Focus. Never falter.
Your inhibitor has been destroyed. Your inhibitor has been destroyed. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your team has destroyed an inhibitor. An ally has been slain.
Castellano. Peace. Never falter.
Toward the tree.
Peace.
Shut down. Double kill.
Peace. Never falter. Never falter.
Where next?
Shut down.
Looks can be deceiving. Would I lie? It's all smoke and mirrors.
Never falter.
A summoner has disconnected.
put in safeguards so that you are the one and only keeper of your data, so to speak. Brought up all sorts of targeted weaponry, by sort of bioweapons possibilities that I was interested in. And then I'd ask that person, who's clearly like willing to step outside of the box of whatever he's working on day to day, who are two of your close friends or two thinkers you really pay a lot of attention to who are kind of at the bleeding edge of something and unorthodox? And then I would just continue to have these conversations over and over again. And the stream of development that I paid a lot of attention to is something along the lines of the following. So the very beginnings are usually in some type of extreme case. And I think the extremes, and this goes for product design as well, but the extremes inform the mean, but not vice versa. So you can actually learn a lot by studying edge cases. So racehorses, for instance, you'll often see things start with, say, racehorses or people with wasting diseases, for instance, or any type of chronic or terminal illness who are willing to try some more experimental interventions. Then let's just take one step further, bodybuilding. See a lot of interesting behavior in bodybuilding and high-level athletes, then billionaires, then rich people, then the rest of us, right? So my assumption is, and was for the 4-Hour Body, that along the lines of William Gibson's quote, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So I'm never predicting the future. I'm just finding the seeds that are germinating that I think are going to bloom and end up spreading really, really widely. So that's generally where I start. And I assume the practitioners are going to be ahead of the papers. So studying, say, the coaches whose jobs are on the line, who are getting paid based on athlete performance, and assuming that a lot of that will eventually, if it holds up, make its way into, say, the peer-reviewed exercise science papers, but it's going to have a lag time of 3 to 5 years.
At least.
At least. Yeah. At least. It takes a long time.
Yeah, science is often very slow to catch up.
Yeah.
You mentioned many things I have questions about. You mentioned paying attention to the new, the very old, or the orphaned. So interesting, and I just thought I'd tell you that when you sit down with a graduate student or a postdoc and they're trying to come up with a project, rarely do you say, like, what do you want to work on? And they fire back like a really interesting question. Sometimes they do, but that's the rare person. More often than not, you'll send them to the literature and they'll come back like, okay, there's this new technique that we can use to answer a set of questions better than ever before, or there's a very old theory I want to revisit, or there's this theory that no one pays attention to. In fact, we had one guest on here, Oded Rashavi, who is studying it, essentially inheritance of traits, transgenerational inheritance of traits. It's a little bit, although different from Lamarckian evolution, but it's a lot like that in some ways. And these orphan theories that everyone assumed were wrong, and that there's a basis for them. So I think there's real genius in that analysis. It also struck me as you were listing off some of your process circa the writing of the 4-Hour Body, that I and many other people are probably curious about what the operations around all that looked like. So are you, or were you at the time, like waking up in the morning going, okay, I'm going to take a walk and think about the new, the old, and the orphaned, or I'm going to take a walk or sit in a chair and think about, like, what are the nerds doing right now? What are rich people doing right now? Or cobbling together awkward solutions. Was that exploration a structured practice for you? Or is this just something that was the consequence of being Tim Ferriss, waking up in the morning and just like leaning into that? Because I've
totally
experienced both, right?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of us are curious. I mean, there's a lot of mystique around you, whether you like
best to dispel it.
whether you like it or not. It's there, and we're not trying to pry, but
Pry away.
Is the establishment of structure for you something that's the consequence of structure in the first place? It's like, okay, now it's time to think.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you just allow things to geyser up to the surface?
I do both. And I would say that in the case of the 4-Hour Body, it's a bit of an anomaly compared to my later books, because I had recorded effectively every workout I had done since age 16 as a competitive athlete. I had a lot of records, and I kept copious notes on supplement use and everything imaginable. So I have what you might call hypergraphy. I just capture almost everything in writing. And
Welcome to Summoner's Rift. "30 seconds until minions spawn."
Classic misdirection.
Minions have spawned.
Where next? Surprised to see me? There's no escape. Right where I want. Trust me. It's all smoke and mirrors.
First blood.
Looks can be deceiving. Patience, summoner.
An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Would I? Are you certain?
Slain an enemy.
Watch closely. Classic misdirection. Tricky, aren't you? What a treat. Trust me. Time to make an appearance.
An ally has been slain.
It's all smoke.
Enemy double kill.
Looks can be deceiving. There's no escape.
An
Patience.
enemy has been slain.
Surprised to see me? Are you certain? Would I lie? Tricky, aren't you? Classic misdirection. Watch closely. Where next?
Enemy has been slain.
It's all smoke and mirrors. Patience, summoner.
Your turret has been destroyed. An ally has been slain.
Looks can be deceiving.
You have slain the enemy.
Classic misdirection. Where next?
Shut down. Double kill. Ally has been slain.
It's all smoke and mirrors. Patient summoner. Time to make an appearance.
Turret plating will fall soon.
Good from dead ones. Amazing death.
Would I lie?
Killing spree.
Looks can be deceiving. Surprised to see me?
Rampage. Enemy has been slain.
Classic misdirection.
Your turret has been destroyed.
Trust me. Where next?
Now!
An ally has been slain. Your turret has been destroyed. Unstoppable.
Are you certain?
An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Patience, summoner. Would I lie? Looks can be deceiving. Tricky, aren't you?
An ally has been slain. Killing spree.
Watch close.
Ally has been slain. The enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. Your turret has been destroyed. An ally has been slain.
Iris. Looks can be deceiving.
Enemy double kill. Enemy killing spree.
Would I lie?
Executed.
Tricky, aren't
Your turret has been destroyed.
you? Classic misdirection.
Legendary. An ally has been slain.
Patience, son.
An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain.
It's all smoke and mirrors. Trust me. Where next? Patience, summoner. Looks can be deceiving.
Shut down. Slain an enemy.
Tricky, aren't you? Would I lie? There's no escape.
An enemy has been slain.
All smoke and mirrors.
Been slain.
Are you sick? Trust me.
Has been slain. Double kill.
Patience, summoner. Tricky.
Your team has destroyed a turret.
Try to see.
Ally has been slain. Shut down. An ally has been slain. Enemy double kill. Ace. Your inhibitor has been destroyed. Your turret has been destroyed. Your turret has been destroyed. Defeat.
That was very useful because at various points in time, let's just say I looked at a photograph of myself from making this up, but 2004, and I think I would like to look and feel like that again. Okay, let me revisit my workout logs. Let me just replicate the preceding 3 to 6 months of workouts and look at my intake and my diet at the time. And lo and behold, more or less, I could replicate the same type of look and feel and performance. So I had a lot already logged that I thought was worth examining and putting under scrutiny, trying to replicate with other people. I do think replication is really important. And then when it came time to commit to writing the book, I thought about what types of mini books would be of great interest to me personally. And that book, like many of my other books, was written in such a fashion that it could be a choose your own adventure book. did not need to be read. In fact, in many ways, it shouldn't be read linearly from page 1 to the end. You get to pick and choose which chapters are of interest based on breath hold, vertical jump, endurance, hypertrophy, cold exposure for fat loss, whatever it might be. And then I began talking to people. And at the very outer bounds of self-experimentation, at least in the Bay Area, it's a pretty small community. So you're 1 or 2 lily pads from just about everyone. And it's not accidental that I put myself in that environment in San Francisco specifically, and more generally in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, because there's just a high surface area for luck to stick to, because you have so many serendipitous encounters, you have so many people focusing on different disciplines. That, I think, was the fertilizer and the fertile ground for everything else, was actually the choosing the where of writing, physically being located in San Francisco. And then when I'm structuring things, maybe I'll get into some of the nitty gritty, but I was using at the time, and I still like to use a program called Scrivener, which is actually designed predominantly for screenwriting. It's used for many things now, novels and so on. It's expanded its reach quite a bit, but it allows you to gather research and all of your documents and drafts so that you can move them around in very novel ways, so that you can view, say, a split pane of your research and what you're working on simultaneously without having to toggle between a lot of different windows. And I was very promiscuous in my gathering of data. So I would gather from, say, the web using a web clipper from Evernote, which I was involved with as a company, and basically without bias capture as much as possible, put 3 asterisks next to anything that I thought I really might want to revisit after I'd read something a second time, which I would always do. Then I could Control F to find just 3 asterisks, because they don't occur much in normal writing. Just like people, authors, writers will use TK, meaning find such and such a date. Data needs to be inserted later, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of writing. Let me put in TK. This doesn't really appear in natural language much. In terms of structured thinking, the way I approached it was, during that period of time in my life, it was interviews, tracking people down, conversations, emails, reading, so ingestion, let's just say, for the workday, then a break for training, and actually using myself as the human guinea pig for various things that had surfaced that might be on the docket.
Where were you training at that time? San Francisco is not famous for amazing gyms.
It's not famous for amazing gyms. At the time, I was training mostly at a climbing gym called Mission Cliffs. They didn't have much, but they had barbells,
Yeah, I know that
and they
place.
had and they had kettlebells.
Yep.
I also had in the walkway leading from the front door of the apartment I was renting. It was more of a house. The front door all the way to the first set of stairs, there were 30 kettlebells of various types. And I was training for certification, so I wanted to put myself on some type of deadline with accountability for that type of training to get a better understanding of it. So I trained for a few hours. I also had developed a friendship with Kelly Starrett, San Francisco CrossFit, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for.
Likewise.
On multiple levels.
He's terrific. And his new book,
Yeah, Built to Move.
his great book, he's so good.
Yeah, he really not only talks the talk, but walks the walk, and exemplifies many of the capabilities that he teaches, which I take seriously. I like practitioners, not just the people with pretty theories, although the theories are important. I prefer to see someone who can actually put them into practice. So Kelly served that function, certainly, and we're still very close friends. And then after that, all right, shake off the cobwebs, get the body moving, get the brain moving, also eat, and then I would actually focus on synthesis. So I would write generally from, let's call it 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. through to 4 or 5 a.m. And I would ride the wave if I happened to be in the zone. If I weren't in the zone, I wouldn't force it, and I would try to get more sleep. But I have always performed best with my writing in those witching hours of, let's call it 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And my experience is that the writers I've interviewed, the writer friends I've become close with, if you look at when they made themselves, not necessarily what they do now, right? But what they did that eventually got them to escape velocity, they're almost always doing most of their writing very late at night or very early in the morning when the rest of the world or their social group is inactive.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I say wow because, of course, all of this was prior to the publication of Matt Walker's seminal book, right? Why We Sleep, which I really see as the book that shifted a lot of people, fortunately, from the I'll sleep when I'm dead mindset to really paying attention to it. And, I don't think Matt gets enough credit. I mean, there's been a revision of a few points within that book, but the majority of it is just spot on and
hyper legitimate.
So good. And yet what you're describing is a schedule that, starting to write at 9 p.m. and finishing up around 4 a.m. But you talked about research earlier that day and training and eating. So were there naps in there?
I would sleep from, say, 4 to maybe 11 or 12. So I would be getting up later. And I've had conversations with Matt about this. And there are night owls and morning larks.
Yep,
And
yep.
there are certainly differences in the code, meaning the genetics, but that worked very, very well for me for a very long time. It is, however, a very challenging social schedule. So once you have a significant other, and every girlfriend I've ever had is a morning person, if you want to spend time together, that schedule just does not work. So I made compromises later for the social side of things. But if you put a gun to my head and said, you need to write the best book humanly possible, that is your only priority outside of some exercise and fuel, I would follow the same schedule.
I know several very successful podcasters, Lex Friedman in particular, who I think he's trying to follow a more normal schedule now, but he's pseudo-nocturnal, at least by my read.
Yeah.
And there are a couple other online content creators, Derek from More Plates, More Dates, who's hyper-productive in his domain and is mostly nocturnal. And then as you're describing your writing routine and your overall routine, I was thinking that, the great skateboarder, everyone knows Tony Hawk, who is obviously a great skateboarder, no doubt about that, but Rodney Mullen, who invented the Ollie on Street, the kickflip, the Ollie, Rodney is basically nocturnal. And has been for a long time, and would skateboard up and down the boardwalk in Santa Monica in the middle of the night because lack of distraction. Yes, it really was. And he's been doing that since his teens. I don't know what he's doing these days, but I think a lot of creators just need space. And I always wonder if that's because when they, at least the ones that are not socially dysfunctional, like yourself, who when they are around people, there's this almost hopefully a desire to interact. So you almost have to remove the stimulus completely.
Yeah, it removes the plausible deniability, which might not be the perfect use of that phrase, but in the sense that it's harder to fool yourself into thinking you're doing something important when you're checking your messages or social media at 2 a.m. Who are we kidding, folks? You should be writing in this case, right? And writers will do anything to avoid writing. I remember Ayn Rand wrote a book about writing, which is actually fantastic. I can't remember the exact title. It might just be On Nonfiction Writing, something like that. And she talked about polishing the sneakers or the shoes before writing. Like, I really just need to do this one thing, which is to just clean up that shoe, because somebody should really clean it up. And at some point I should clean it up. And therefore, why don't I just there's no time like the present. I'll just do that. And it's all to avoid writing, which is the harder thing. And in my conversations with Matt also, I should say that as someone who has self-described as a person who struggles with onset insomnia, Matt made the point, and sometimes we need to relearn things. Maybe you should just go to bed later.
Sure.
And that might address some of this onset insomnia. And I don't know the causes for that, but I do get a second wind very late. It could be related to some cortisol release abnormality or just different scripting in my system, who knows.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, now called AG1, is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that covers all of your foundational nutritional needs. I've been taking Athletic Greens since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens once or usually twice a day is that it gets me the probiotics that I need for gut health. Our gut is very important. It's populated by gut microbiota that communicate with the brain, the immune system, and basically all the biological systems of our body to strongly impact our immediate and long-term health. And those probiotics in Athletic Greens are optimal and vital for microbiotic health. In addition, Athletic Greens contains a number of adaptogens, vitamins, and minerals that make sure that all of my foundational nutritional needs are met, and it tastes great. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman, and they'll give you 5 free travel packs that make it really easy to mix up Athletic Greens while you're on the road, in the car, on the plane, etc. And they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Huberman to get the 5 free travel packs and the year's supply of vitamin D3K2.
I'll mention one other maybe heuristic that I use for trying to peek around corners, which is if I find an example of an outlier, trying to find 2 or 3, right? Because 1 is an exception, 2 is interesting, 3 is worth investigating. That's sort of how I think about it. And I recognize the thorough anecdote does not equal data. However, a lot of interesting discoveries begin as case studies or case histories. And so there are some things we can talk about that I've paid attention to over the last few years that are not in the 4-Hour Body that I think are quite interesting and raise very, very exciting questions. But
I'd love to hear about those.
Yeah.
And along the lines of what I call anecdata, I mean, most of what we know about human memory stems from one patient, HM, who had his hippocampi removed for epilepsy. And of course, there have been millions, probably close to millions of studies in animals and humans focusing on the hippocampi, but most of what we know about human memory is from one guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's a lot to be examined. Not all of it will get funding for RCTs. Let's be realistic. This is especially true if you're hoping for any type of directive data. Notice I'm not saying conclusive, but if you are human who's going to be making decisions about diet, health, exercise, if you want any consensus, you're doomed. You're not going to get any answers before you die.
Can you say that twice so that the internet can hear it extra loud and clear? For those of you that are arguing about nutrition on Twitter, like it might actually be life wasted.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not being judgmental. I mean, I think that there's validity in lots of those pockets. There's stuff that's wrong in lots of those pockets.
Yeah.
There are diets that work extremely well, like, 4-hour diet. Or it's slow carb. I always call it the 4-hour diet, but the slow carb diet.
Yeah.
It works extremely well. Anytime I followed it, I get much leaner and stronger and all that stuff that it's purported to do. It works. But yeah, maybe you could just explain what you mean by that, because I think there are some argument/friction spaces that are truly an energy sink.
Yeah. I would just say focus on what works for you and your family or your team. And if you're arguing on the internet, recognize that you're just doing it because you like arguing on the internet. You're not going to convince anyone of anything. And you're just going to make yourself more frustrated if you plan on changing any opinions. So for me, it's live and let live. And the more people who engage in that type of behavior, the more competitive advantage you have if you don't. So for me, I'm like, okay, if you want to spend this vital non-renewable resource of yours called time on that, if I ever compete against you, I'm going to win. So great. I'll just, I'll also not even try to convince you to stop doing that unless you see the logic in it, which I have, which is why I also don't have, at least for 2 years, have mostly had no social apps installed on my phone. And we could talk about that because I think recognizing that these things have been engineered to overcome any type of self-discipline with billions of dollars at stake should lead you to believe that you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. So I just don't have the apps on my phone to begin with. And I find it much more gratifying to see disproportionate change from small inputs. So that's what I'm looking for. And I'm also looking for changes that are easy to make, that can have high adherence, that have very limited downside, which is very different from proving something. For instance, in the 4-Hour Body, took a look at the potential effect of cell phones or the proximity of cell phones to, say, gonadal function and reproductive health. And the literature that was available at the time was very limited. Had some animal studies, mice, rats, etc. I recognize humans are not just large mice, so they don't always translate. But I looked at it and I said, okay, looking at this simplistically, is it plausible that there could be similar effects on humans? Seems to be the case, also based on conversations with people who are specialists but would never go on record. Therefore, if your phone is in your pocket, just have it on airplane mode. I mean, it does not have a high cost. And then, pending any revision, we can see, but while the jury's still out, I'm going to risk mitigate by taking this step.
Well, and I just want to say thank you there too. I read that recommendation. I followed the recommendation of not keeping the phone on in my front pocket or back pocket. And that's anecdata.
Yep.
My sperm analysis isn't relevant to this conversation, but worked out. But you could say, well, that's not necessarily because you had the phone off. But I did a very long, detailed episode on male and female fertility. Mm-hmm. There is now what I view as a really quality meta-analysis, and it's pretty clear that there are effects of the smartphone on proximity of the smartphone when it's turned on that are not good for sperm. Isn't necessarily going to render somebody sterile, but on sperm that can be separated out from the heat effects. And so essentially this is another instance in which you were right. And I think more data will come out. And am I a EMF conspiracy theorist? No. Do I wear tinfoil underwear? No. But I think it's interesting. I think it's important. And thanks to you, cued my attention to it. In fact, I teach about that in a course on neural circuits and biology and health and disease.
Amazing. Yeah. And I don't expect to get everything right at all. Yeah, that would be crazy. I'd like to think I'm not totally crazy. And it's very important if you are going to do self-experimentation or experimentation in small groups, which the Quantified Self community did quite well, and I think still does quite well. You should really make every effort to not fool yourself, which is hard. It's challenging at times. But read books like Bad Science. Read books like How to Lie with Statistics. Ensure that you are able to read studies well. You don't have to be the best in the world, but that you can, on some level, identify the strengths and weaknesses of studies. This doesn't take a long time. Certainly our friend Peter Attia, Dr. Peter Attia, has Studying the Studies, which is a multiple-part blog series dedicated to this. There are other ways to approach it. I took one of his podcasts, republished it on the Tim Ferriss Show, because it talked about how to examine studies, what powering refers to, things like this. In the span of 1 or 2 weeks, you could really become literate with the building blocks of scientific literacy with respect to reading studies. And that gives you such an enormous life advantage. It's hard to overstate.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that there are a lot of things that just simply will not ever be explored in a randomized control trial. One of the things that Peter and I have talked about before is he texted me, what are your thoughts on BPC-157? This is a gastropeptide that's now been synthesized, so people will inject it into a tissue that they're trying to heal or improve. Lots of anecdata on BPC-157, making injuries heal faster, et cetera. Again, anecdata. I've used it. I took an injection of it yesterday, in fact. Peter basically is not a believer because there is a lack of published data on this, which is perfectly fine. Or I should say he's skeptical. And so there's always that possibility of a placebo effect.
Yeah.
But I don't think there will ever be a really nice controlled trial on BPC-157 because the financial incentives aren't there.
Yeah.
And no smart graduate student is going to go do a thesis on this. So that's the reality. I mean, maybe one will do it now that we're having this conversation, but it just doesn't, the payout isn't there.
Yeah. And that last one you mentioned is one that people miss a lot. People doing these studies are people with careers who are planning their careers. And so they choose what they're going to invest time in very carefully. So that's another limiter on what will end up in an RCT or not, right? So I think that's good for people to hear. And as you get more involved with science, in my case through a foundation, the SciSafe Foundation funding a lot of early stage science, you realize how expensive it is and how long it takes. It is a long-term investment. And if you are looking to make behavioral changes or modify aspects of yourself, cognitive, physical, psycho-emotional, or otherwise, identifying interventions, right, options that seem to have some plausible upside, like there is a mechanism that might make sense in humans. If you feel fairly certain there's very limited downside, which should include talking to people who are presenting their results as anecdata, then maybe you consider using X if you can cap your downside. Right? And I recall, for instance, looking at trans resveratrol, specifically not for longevity, but in potentially increasing endurance for 4-hour body. And I ended up testing it, and there's a funny story associated with that. Didn't quite work out as planned, and I don't use it any longer. But what I experienced prior to actually finding this on forums was joint pain, elbow pain. The one most consistent side effect was what felt like tendinosis in the elbows. And then I went online, and I'd already done this, but I hadn't come across, I think it was the 500, people have been using 500 milligrams of trans resveratrol daily for long periods of time. And one of the most common reported side effects is joint pain. And I was like, okay, I'm not willing to make that trade-off.
Yeah.
And
Makes sense to me.
yeah,
I think it would be fun if ever you were willing that we could do a hybrid podcast on supplement fails.
I have some spectacular failures.
As do I. And I'm thinking about a few of them. I mean, some that were really took me off course. Like there's one supplement called Bulbine natalensis. This is another one of these shrubs.
Sounds like an infection.
I mean, this thing will really spike your testosterone and free testosterone. I'm talking back acne, like huge strength gains, aggression. It's really wild. And then after about 7 to 10 days, it all crashes and you go below baseline. Oh yeah, even testicular pain. So it was unclear. So if you're a smart person, you halt use, right? So I can understand why people are skeptical of certain things. And then of course there are supplements that I'm a big fan of, and that you're a big fan of. We talked about those things elsewhere, but it might be fun to do a supplement fails podcast. If ever you're willing, though.
I could do just experimental fails.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, N of 1 experimental fails, which include things that people might not think about. For instance, 4-Hour Body had quite a bit of real estate dedicated to looking at things like PRP. So platelet-rich plasma, I think there's a role for it. It's not useful for everything, but for certain types of injury repair, I think it's very interesting. Every time you get injected, this is where you have to be careful because there are very few free lunches out there. There's usually some type of feedback loop, and your system is very smart at auto-regulating things. This is outside of that, a consideration that I hadn't made, which is every time you have an injection, there's a chance of an infection, particularly if the site, in my case, was the elbow, and the injection was made for the PRP, not quite where it should have been, slightly to the rear of the elbow where the skin is very thick, and so it pushed staph bacteria from a mid layer of the skin into the joint capsule.
Not good.
And that really could have ended very poorly. I ended up having to go to the ER and get it all removed and so on, but that could have ended up in a much, much more severe situation. So you do have to be careful with this stuff. I've become a little more conservative with some of what I do, including injections. I'm like, all right, let me think twice about the injections. If I'm going to swallow something, let me make sure I'm really looking at the implications for the liver.
Yeah, smart. Very smart. I'm curious about some of the things that you talk about in the 4-Hour Body and that you've mentioned today. Things like accelerometers, continuous glucose monitors, deliberate cold exposure. how many of those things are you still doing on a regular basis? And how many do you, use a couple times a week or a couple times a month, or go through phases of using and not using?
Cold exposure I use as consistently as is practical. So if I'm traveling, it's a little harder, but we're in LA right now. One of the first things I did was find a few options for contrast therapy. One of the first things I did. And by contrast, I do not mean infrared sauna and cold plunge. I'd much rather have hot and cold water, just in terms of sort of speed of heating.
The Japanese approach.
Right. For just speed of vasodilation, particularly for injury recovery, I think it's incredibly helpful. For mood regulation, certainly that's the case. And cold water for mood regulation or the treatment of, say, depression, or as a preemptive intervention to avoid or mitigate depression, is old. It used to be prescribed for melancholy. And people like the Van Goghs of the world would be prescribed cold baths. So that was something I was like, well, let's take a look at some of the old history, read about that, and then look into PubMed and so on to see what might be supported. So the cold, I'm still
It's
using.
all smoke.
I've become increasingly interested, this was not in the 4-hour body, but whole body hyperthermia, often excluding the head for depression, which I know there's some research.
Yeah, out of UCSF
Yeah, exactly.
right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this-
really interesting studies. Too early to report. I'm not involved in these, but I think these are really important
Yeah.
studies, because for all the people saying, oh, well, it's ice bath stuff, metabolism this, metabolism that. But one thing that's very clear is long-lasting, very significant increase in the catecholamines, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Not a replacement, perhaps, for antidepressant medication, but as you said, to move the needle toward antidepressant states. That's the cocktail. And heat as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the hypothermia, especially the way it's formatted right now with some of the research, is very early stages. There's going to be less adherence. It's not as readily available, say, a cold shower or cold bath. So I do think about the practical implications of that, but right now it's very interesting. Slow carb diet, still use it all the time. It is not my default 24/7 as it used to be. So maybe I'm just getting older and more self-indulgent, but if I find myself going off the rails a bit and I'm like, okay, I'm getting closer to muffin top here, let's stage an intervention, then I will go immediately back to slow carb diet. And within a matter of weeks, it's pretty easily corrected. And
Just a cue for people. I know that slow carb diet achieved great prominence. In fact, wasn't it featured on or mentioned in an episode of Orange is the New Black?
I think it might have been.
Yeah.
It's made
That's-
appearances on a handful of shows.
Great. I realize that I've been referring to the slow carb diet several times throughout this discussion. So for those that aren't familiar with the slow carb diet, I know they can go look up what that is, but so that we can keep them here for the rest of this discussion and not have to send them out and back just yet. Could you give us just a brief top contour of what the slow carb diet is?
Sure. This slow carb diet is intended to be a simple, easy to adhere to diet for people who have perhaps failed other diets that allows you to recompose your body. So improve muscle mass, body fat percentage, and the rules are really important. And that's part of what makes it work. It's not ideal for every sport and every circumstance, but broadly speaking, it works for a lot of people who've had trouble with dieting in the past. So rule number 1, don't drink calories. That's it. Very simple. So black coffee, unsweetened tea, great. Juice, out. Anything with calories, out. You could add a little bit of heavy cream to your coffee, let's say, but that's also bending the rules in a way that I don't like. So in the beginning, it's like follow the rules so you can break them later. So in the beginning, let's just say you can't drink calories. Number 2, don't eat anything white. Sounds pretty basic, right? Just don't eat anything that is the color of white or it could be white. Basically, that means you're going to be avoiding starches and things that are similar to starches.
That includes things like oatmeal.
That includes things like oatmeal. So roughly speaking, just avoiding things that are white or that could be white will get you pretty far. And yes, there are exceptions, like cauliflower, fine, you can have cauliflower. But again, don't get fancy, right? It's very easy to outsmart yourself when it comes to behavioral change. Keep it simple. So for at least 2 weeks, forget about the exceptions, right? Don't drink calories, don't eat anything white, and then eat 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. Okay, you got that. And then there are a few buckets you can choose from, right? So you have vegetables, beans and lentils, and then some type of protein. So you're going to come up with meals that you can follow without deviating for a period of 1 or 2 weeks. Just come up with the same meals. And that's going to sound boring, yes, but guess what? You do it already. You just might not realize it. And the lentils and the beans specifically, as a prereq, we can get into some of the reasons, but add a lot of fiber and also inhibit appetite, right? So that's actually a very important component of these meals. And there may be a handful of other rules, but those are the basics. And then the redemption is take 1 day off per week and just go fucking crazy. That's a cheat day. There are some epic cheat days out there. Some I've captured for myself. And anything goes. When I say anything, I do mean anything. So if you want to consume multiple pizzas, pints of ice cream, whatever, indulge. I left one out. No fruit during the week. So avoid fruit, avoid fructose. So agave nectar, anything that is sort of hidden sugar, avoid all that. So no added sweeteners, obviously, but avoid fruit and fructose. And again, it's not going to kill you. Guess what? If you're from European ancestry, your ancestors did not have like blueberries in the middle of winter, generally speaking, right? So you'll be fine for a few weeks. And then there's that cheat day, and cheat day, anything goes. The amount of damage you can do on cheat day is pretty limited, and there are ways you can mitigate that. There's a whole chapter called damage control in the 4 Hour Body, but focusing just on that diet and having one day off where you know you can do anything means when you are controlling yourself for those 6 days of the week, you're not giving up your favorite foods forever. You can even keep a list of all things you want to eat on cheat day, and then you have free license to eat on cheat day, and that provides you with a release valve so that you can build in the cheating as opposed to having it occur as a failure point. And there are a handful of other things there. If you have domino foods in the house, for instance, if you eat a lot of almonds or mixed nuts, and you're just going to sit there compulsively eating them while you're sitting at your laptop, don't have what I call domino foods in the house, which are going to really create some portion control issues. But broadly speaking, don't drink calories, don't eat things that are white, take from 3 categories and build your meals out, and those are the meals that you follow. Do not eat fruit or fructose, and then cheat 1 day a week. And Saturday's a nice day for cheat day for most folks. And just to answer some questions people can have, no, that doesn't mean 24 hours. You just spread out over 2 days. That will actually set you back. But the amount of fat you can store in a handful of sittings over 24 hours, which legitimately is more like 12 to 18 hours, pretty limited. So that's just look at diet.
Great. Thank you for that. I also want to ask, is it okay to take the day after cheat day and fast or do 1 meal that day? When I followed this low carb diet, I benefited from it tremendously. Lost fat, gained muscle, tons of energy, sleeping great, required less caffeine, all sorts of wonderful things. Stable blood sugar. I felt so good. Really enjoyed the cheat days. I really enjoyed the cheat days. So much fun. At some point, there's some gastric distress that comes from not regulating intake, which led me to not want to eat the next day. So I tended to do the cheat days on Sunday in my case, and then I would fast most of Monday, just water, black coffee, tea, and then I might have a small meal in the evening, and then by Tuesday I was back on the slow carb diet. Does that seem like a sort of a detrimental deviation from the plan?
I think that if that is what works for you, then that is what works for you. So this is the slow carb diet template for me is the starting point, and generally I'll say, I think this is from Picasso, right? It's like learn the rules as an amateur so you can break them as a professional. But it's like I recommend most people kind of stick with the format for a handful of weeks and measure the results, right? So there are guidelines for how to measure. The scale is a bit of a blunt instrument, so there are other ways. But if you're extremely overweight, you can just use the scale. And fasting, I think, is fine. Or just ratcheting back your caloric consumption significantly. And what happens over time for most people also is for the first, say, 4 weeks on cheat day, you're going to go completely insane. And I remember I was doing something much stricter called the cyclical ketogenic diet, which is a whole separate thing. It's much more limiting in terms of what you can eat. But I was training for ultimately the nationals in Chinese kickboxing. This was happening in '99. So I was training super hard. I was following a cyclical ketogenic diet, which meant I could eat very few things, but I did have this one cheat day. And I would do a glycogen depletion workout beforehand, which is one of the things you can do to limit the damage on cheat day. Do a glycogen depletion workout beforehand, and then I would just go crazy. I mean, I would drive to like Krispy Kreme, buy 12 donuts, and they would be gone by the time I got home. And it wasn't an hour away. It was like 10 minutes. Donuts would be gone, right? I would go to Safeway, and I would buy a bag of those fun-sized Snickers, and that would be just a tiny portion of my calorie
stuff for you, huh?
A lot of sweet stuff. I also did the savory stuff. I mean, I had my favorites.
Nothing was safe.
Pizza. Nothing was safe. Nothing was safe. My paws got into everything. And then over time, because the next day you're going to feel like you got hit by a diabetic dump truck, you start rationing back. And you're like, okay, maybe I don't need to do that. Maybe cheat day will just be cheat day. Or maybe cheat day will just be like the pastries in the morning with the coffee. And you start to regulate a bit, generally. You don't have to, but over time you generally will. And I think after you've followed it to the T, just follow the commandments for say 4 to 8 weeks, then you can certainly deviate. And I'm not saying if you're not hungry, don't eat. However, in many cases, people have acclimated to not eating in the morning, and then they end up overeating later in the day. If you have that habit, right? If you're consuming 50% of your calories or more at dinner, and you want to lose body fat, I would say get some cottage cheese or something that will give you 30 grams easily in the morning. Worst case scenario, you take it just don't make it hypercaloric.
Maybe powdered protein, like
Could be powdered whey protein. Whole food is going to do a lot more.
and no calorie counting, correct?
No calorie. It tends to be self-limiting. when you're eating this much fiber and this much protein, it tends to be very self-limiting what you'll want to consume and what you can consume.
Once again, I had great experiences with slow carb diet, and I'm going to go back on.
Yeah, nobody needs to buy anything to figure it out. If you just search on tim.blog, slow carb diet, there you'll get everything that you need to get started. No purchase necessary.
Well, it works very, very well, I'll say that, and it's very straightforward to follow, and it does include the notorious cheat day, or infamous cheat day,
Yep.
And it can be done on a very reasonable budget. And so if people want to learn more about that, they should go to Tim's blog on 4 Hour Body and Slow Carb Diet. We'll provide a link.
Yep.
But it's, I think it's worth highlighting again just how effective that is. As you pointed out, thousands and thousands of people using it to great success, some of whom were quite obese. And any updates on those folks? Are they still keeping the weight off?
I would like to do a follow-up. I think with diets in general, there's a lot of reversion to the mean, regression to the mean. So I would expect that some have kept it off and some have not. That would be true of, I think, every possible diet, especially for people who are overcoming behavioral inertia of having gained hundreds of pounds. But I'd like to do some follow-up. What was fun about the post I put together called How to Lose 100 Pounds on the Slow Carb Diet, we profiled, say, 4 or 5 people, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. And this was a very long time ago. So I would say that a long-term follow-up would be super interesting. And we did at one point track several thousand people through a platform at the time, I think it was Coach.me, as they followed the slow carb diet for the first sort of 4 to 12 weeks. And that was fascinating because I want the data. And I'm happy to be proven incorrect with any of my assumptions. I mean, I don't view that as a failure. I view that as a huge net gain. And it has a very high adherence rate. So I pay attention to not just is something effective, does it get you the outcome you want? Not only is it efficient from a time and resource perspective, but how high is the adherence rate? If you take a random sampling of 1,000 people from the US across socioeconomic classes, et cetera, how many people, practically speaking, will be able to or willing to follow this for, say, an 8-week period of time or a 4-week period of time? And I try to optimize for the widest adherence because I know the slow carb diet people come on, they're like, but what about intermittent fasting? What about this? And what about endurance athletes? I'm like, this is not for everybody in all cases. It just happens to be a good default diet with a high adherence rate. And like you said, it's very inexpensive. It can be followed very, very inexpensively.
Sorry to interrupt you. One thing that I really like about it is that many variants on caloric restriction, which is because laws of thermodynamics definitely apply.
Yeah,
we're not trying to say they don't. But one of the issues with a lot of things, including intermittent fasting, which I sort of do some variant of because I'm not really hungry to eat until about 11. I like to train in the morning if I can, etc., is that they can sometimes prevent best performance in terms of, especially resistance training, high intensity resistance training. So very low carb diets, I've tried them. Even if you're paying attention to other ways to restock glycogen, performance drops off. Whereas a slow carb diet, I feel like I can work, I can exercise, I can sleep, like everything just works well. But there's one thing in it that I wanted to raise that when I heard this, I thought there's no way this is true, which was making sure that you get 30 or so grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking.
Yep.
And I thought, how can that be? Like, how can adding protein early in the day actually make a difference? And it really did work. I still track my numbers. So in terms of dropping body fat percentage, increasing muscle, it really does work. Now, whether or not that's simply because it's offsetting food intake that I would have taken in later in the day, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to make myself my own control experiment to the point that I drive myself crazy. But it really does work quite well to get past sticking points, to just get that 30 grams of protein early. So sort of violate the time-restricted feeding component deliberately with some protein in the morning, then still train and do all the other things, and carry on as usual. And it seems so peculiar, like eating more and losing body fat, but it works.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, and a lot of approaches can work for a lot of different people, right? To state the obvious. But this particular aspect of the slow carb diet is helpful for, let's just say, the majority of the people in that 1,000-person sample I was talking about, a hypothetical poll from different parts of, say, the US or anywhere, because it seems to help with a few things. First, there's just the thermic effect of food, of the protein, there's a greater thermic effect. You also have, and I think there's decent, at the time there was decent literature to support this, so I don't know if it's changed, that the protein intake along those lines has an appetite suppressing effect. So the net daily calories consumed tends to be less when someone has a higher protein meal earlier in the day. And last but not least, I would say one of the risks, and there are many people who execute well on this, but you have to be very meticulous, which is true of the ketogenic diet as well. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you do it 60% right or 70% right. You really, you can get yourself
in there. Massive psoriasis. I mean, my scalp, sloughing off, and like when I'm in ketosis, like I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Going back on some complex carbohydrates and it going away.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't need a randomized control trial. No, I simply don't want to run that
Don't
experiment
want to
again.
lose your scalp. Yeah. So in the case of say, time-restricted feeding, some people who do intermittent fasting lose a lot of muscle mass. And there are multiple reasons for this. I think people should make use of relatively widely available tools like DEXA and so on to ensure that your composition is actually moving the way you think it's moving. Make sure you standardize your hydration for that as well as time of day. That's a pro tip for people who don't know. But it seems to get net better effects than trying to teach people how to fast, which you can do. And we can talk about fasting. That's something that was not included in the 4-Hour Body that were I to rewrite it today, I would include a section. And there was a bit in Busy Titans to address that on more extended fasts. Let's just call it 3 to 7 day fasts. So that's an area of great interest in, as is ketosis and metabolic psychiatry, a la Chris Palmer, who we both know.
Incredible. I mean, what the awakening that he's created through his book and going on your podcast, my podcast, and others, and you know, letting people be aware that changes in diet can impact mental health. So I think in 2-3 years, it's going to be a duh. And we're not just talking about the difference between, you know, slamming back horrible foods, horrible for us foods versus eating really clean. I mean, really specific diet protocols to treat mental health. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, super exciting. So that's one of the things that I'm paying a lot of attention to right now. There are a handful in that realm within just say the interplay of mind and body. It's the Cartesian duality and separation of those two makes no sense from a biological standpoint. So that's something that certainly captured my attention. I paid a lot of attention to even as far back as early 2000s for mental health and just cognitive performance.
I'd like to take a quick break and thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done, for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be assessed with a quality blood test. The problem with a lot of blood and DNA tests out there, however, is that they'll give you information about certain lipid markers, hormone markers, but no information about what to do with all of that data. Inside Tracker makes it very easy to look at your levels of hormones, metabolic factors, lipids, etc., and then to assess what sorts of behavioral, nutritional, supplementation, or perhaps other interventions you might want to use in order to bring those numbers into the ranges that are optimal for your health. For this week only, the week of June 19th, 2023, Inside Tracker is offering a buy one, get one free on their ultimate plan. This is their best discount of the year. You can get this offer by going to insidetracker.com/Huberman. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman. Thanks for revisiting some of the 4-Hour Body and slow carb diet and elaborating on some of the process that went into that. And I think creators of all kinds, thinkers of all kinds, and people who are interested in the contents of the 4-Hour Body are going to be very grateful for that information. I certainly am fascinated by your process. One of the things that you mentioned along the lines of process was, you know, the power of places and where one happens to live. I think there's an essay by Paul Graham that talks about this. It's a little outdated, you know, and it talks about the messages that you, the tacit messages of being in certain cities. I think it was, you know, like Boston, you're not smart enough. What was it? It was New York, you're not powerful enough. And not you, I was just thinking, and, or you should be more powerful is the message, like the tacit message. Los Angeles, what you're doing, people aren't paying paying enough attention to it. Something like that. Like the tacit messages, these are stereotypes about cities. Certainly cities change. The role of places is an interesting one. Like, you mentioned, small gathering, Kevin Kelly's house, quantified self. And I think for people who don't know people like that, right? Maybe we could get your thoughts on how would one think about where to live and maybe even curating their own gatherings, useful gatherings. Because it's not that, I have to imagine it's not that you guys sat back and you're like, I'm Tim Ferriss. And he's like, I'm Kevin Kelly. Let's have a gathering so we can talk about it in a few years on a podcast. This stuff happens, that word, dangerous word, organically. When people who have common interests decide to get together and talk and listen and brainstorm. And I'm yet to do that with good people and not have something really incredible come out of it. Not necessarily that day, but looking back 5 years later, it's like, God, that was really worthwhile. Totally. Yeah.
Few thoughts in no particular order. I would say the first is, it depends on, my recommendations depend a lot on where you are in the arc of your career and life. If you are in full growth hyperdrive mode and you are trying to build both yourself and your capabilities in a very concrete way, where you're not necessarily focused on family, you maybe have fewer obligations, then if you're serious, I think many people should consider moving to an area of high density for a period of time. It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be longer, but putting yourself in a New York or an LA or a San Francisco or Chicago, or as new places develop, I'll give you one you might not expect, say Ottawa, Canada, where Shopify is based, and the presence and growth of Shopify has spawned an entire ecosystem of startups. So there may be options outside of the usual cast of characters. Pittsburgh and Duolingo, similar effect. So there are more options than people might recognize, but taking a journey and placing yourself in a place where you can be in a very active pinball machine where you may interact serendipitously with many different people from many different worlds, I think is hard to overstate the value of. And my drive and my filtering function, let's just say, because when I first got to the Bay Area, nobody cared about me. I was nobody. I was driving my mom's used minivan hand-me-down that had the seats stolen out of the back.
Were you in the South Bay?
I was working in San Jose. Yeah.
I mean, no disrespect to San Jose. I'm from the South Bay.
Yeah.
But there's a bleakness to the South
There
Bay.
is a little bit of bleakness. And then I lived across the street in this tiny apartment, lived across the street from the Jack in the Box in Mountain View. So it's not like I was strolling onto the big stage and just blowing people away.
I grew up right near Mountain View. I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
I probably skated the curbs at that
You
Jack in the
probably
Box.
did.
But
Yeah.
Did you train at the Gold's Gym off Rangsdorf?
Did actually.
Amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a great gym.
That's a great gym.
That was a great gym. I don't think it's still
I would
there.
go there
but-
super late before my writing sessions.
Okay.
And it had the benefit of being open really, really late. And wow, Rangsdorf, I haven't thought about that in a long time. So the point is, I also started where a lot of people are starting. And what did I do? I put myself in a high density environment. Next, what did I do? Knowing no one, I started to volunteer at events where they had interesting speakers and interesting people coming to hear those speakers. So I put myself in Silicon Valley, and then I began volunteering for groups like SVACE. I don't know if it exists anymore, the Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs, I think it was. TIE, the Indus Entrepreneur, which is a very sort of Indian or Indian American focused organization that does a lot in the realm of startups. And I would carry water, I would take out garbage, I would check name badges, I would check people in. Nothing was too low for me. And I'll give you guys a tip that will be obvious to some, but non-obvious to many. When you are volunteering, a lot of folks who volunteer do the absolute bare minimum because they are not getting paid. This is not going to get you noticed. But it sets a very low bar so that if you volunteer at these events and someone's dropping the ball or there's something happening that needs fixing and you just proactively do it, the producers of these events will notice you. And this is what happened over time, over a few months. And then I got invited to join in on meetings that were planning future events. And I eventually got to the point where I was recruiting speakers and able to set the agenda for an entire main event. And then that's how I got to know, say, Jack Canfield, who is the co-creator of Chicken Soup for the Soul, and many others, who introduced me to my book agent many, 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 many years later, Jack Canfield. But I was a nobody then. You have to play the long game, but you can be methodical in how you play that. And that is one approach, just as an example, for how to build your network, which snowballs over time. Don't hump every VIP's leg within 10 minutes of meeting them. Play it cool, you know?
And the gatherings where that person has a lot of demands on them is the last place you want to do that.
Yeah,
right?
the way you're going to make
No
yourself memorable,
saliency to that.
Yeah,
right?
the way you're going to make yourself memorable with people like that is to be very professional, always on time, predict what they're going to need or problems they'll run into beforehand and address them before they even think of them, and be easy to deal with. And people like that, high performers, notice these things. They will make note of it.
Yeah, the being easy to work with is something that I used to tell my graduate students, postdocs. I mean, because the opposite of that, nobody wants.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody wants that.
Yeah, especially in the beginning. Like later, okay, great, you're Steve Jobs. You want to be difficult here and there or a lot? No problem, right? But in the beginning, that can be a real liability. You can make up for that if you're the best in the world, but in the very beginning, you probably won't be. So try to stack the deck in your favor. Volunteering is a shortcut, and that would be one way of doing it. Another now, especially given the virtual communities that exist. So you have subreddits, you have online communities, you have Twitter groups, you have Clubhouse. You've got a million different options, which can be overwhelming.
Clubhouse still going?
Maybe not. I have no idea.
Oh, no, I don't know. I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's gone. I remember during the pandemic, there were some Clubhouse gatherings. I hopped on there, but I've sort of forgotten to get
Maybe
on there.
not. The platform affinity is really fickle, which is why I think, to the extent possible, if you want to build a world-class, and I use that term very deliberately, network in record time, just to give you a nice headline, I would say focus on the uncrowded channel, which is in person. It's out of fashion. It's out of vogue. Going to a conference and actually interacting with humans in the hallway, approaching panelists. This is another thing that I did. I'll give another tip. So very early on, I would go to conferences. Nobody cared who I was. Nobody knew who I was. Fine. And I would study the panels. Let's say I'm going to a big event like South by Southwest. And this is what I did in 2007, which was just prior to the first book coming out. And I would go to these various in-person events. I was focused mostly on events that had the thematic focus of blogs. We could come back to that. But blogs were what podcasts were a few years ago. Right? They drove incredible traffic, but they were undervalued by mainstream media, undervalued by mainstream publishers, et cetera, which meant there was an arbitrage opportunity in a way. And I would pick, say, a handful of panels with topics I thought were super interesting. And then the panel would end, and what would happen? The panelists would get rushed by various folks, because many of them were well known. Who was not getting rushed? The moderator. I would go straight to the moderator, and I would talk to the moderator. I'd thank them for the panel. I'd be very genuine. None of it was made up. And talk to them for a bit. They would generally ask why I was there, what I was interested in. I would mention whatever that happened to be. In this case, it was I'm finishing my first book, or I have my first book coming out soon. I'm here to hopefully meet people who are involved with A, B, or C. And then if we hit it off, which was not true every time, but if it seemed to be going well, I would say, I don't know anyone here. I'm really sort of orphaned here, making my way through this entire event. Is there anyone else here you think I would get along with, who maybe I could buy a drink or a coffee? And the vast majority of the time, they'd be like, oh yeah, you should meet so-and-so. And then I get the introduction, and then I would meet that person. I would have a genuine interaction with that person. And if it made sense, if things were going well, I'd do the same thing. Is there anybody else here you think I should just say hi to and get along with? Not who I can ask for something. And that wasn't deception. I was being honest. Like someone I could actually vibe with. And if so, would you mind making the intro? Well, yeah, sure, no problem. Many of those people are still my friends. And by being surgical in that way, not trying to gather business cards, to use a really antiquated metaphor at this point.
People still hand them out.
Yeah, people still hand them out. I guess it depends on where you are, especially like Boston. But if rather than trying to collect people as Pokemon cards, developing, say, 3 to 5 deeper relationships through longer conversations at an event, that is what directly led ultimately to the hockey stick for the 4-hour work week within tech, within specifically San Francisco. So those would be a few approaches for building your network when you don't have the ability to just walk up to, say, Kevin Kelly and have a conversation. That came over time.
Whether or not it's health practices or nutritional practices or at meetings, it seems you're oriented toward the uncrowded but very interesting people in spaces. But the keyword there, I think, is uncrowded. And of course, the other keyword is interesting, right? I mean, it's not like you're standing in the parking lot talking to whoever happens to be there, although that can be interesting, right? Yeah. There's a serendipity there, and there's always things to learn from people. But in terms of career advancement and building new ideas and foraging for information, I'm just struck how you've done that over and over. And again, thank you for giving us some insight into the process. Please.
Here's another one. So I think there's a tendency among people who want to develop their networks with their relationships to be star fuckers. Not to get too technical, but
that's a technical term.
Yeah. And they want to tell other people they are friends with someone more than they want to develop skills or learn from someone. This puts you in a very disadvantaged position, because then that means, all right, you want to become friends with Elon Musk? Good luck. Or you want to become friends with this A-lister celebrity who everyone else wants to meet? Good luck. It's going to be a crowded, bloody path to get there. And by the way, they've also certainly developed really attuned defenses against people like you. So it's going to be hard.
They have staff to prevent that from happening.
They have a phalanx of protectors to prevent you from ever getting to that person. On the other hand, if you're approaching it from the standpoint of developing skills, learning, and actually becoming potential friends with someone, I'll give you an example. You could go after, you want to become better at boxing. Let's just make that up. All right. Maybe not the greatest example. Skiing would be another one, but let's stick with boxing just because of the way I'll explain it. If you wanted to, say, get personalized lessons from Floyd Mayweather, ain't gonna happen. Okay, let's go then maybe a step down out of the pro ranks to gold medalist. Okay, if it's a brand new gold medalist, let's just say like Oscar de la Hoya when he was a golden boy and just thrashed everyone, still gonna be hard. What about the silver medalist who just had a bad day when he had that last bout against Oscar de la Hoya? Potentially, right? From a technical perspective, from a personal connection perspective, you may have more in common with that person or a bronze medalist, and they can get you 70, 80, 90% of the way there. And by the way, you probably don't have the physical attributes to make it to 100% anyway, if you're coming to it this late. And you could get, in many cases, one-on-one lessons, whether in person or virtually, with someone who is of that caliber. They're in the same front of the pack as the names I just mentioned, maybe not as famous. $100, $200 per hour? For a lot of people, that is huge.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the value of saying one knows somebody very famous is. It's just never been something I've oriented to.
It's a common orientation. Yeah. And I think that's true for a lot of things. Like many people use, say, psychedelics because they want to tell other people the story that they have of doing psychedelics. right? They're not doing it intrinsically for what they hope to get out of that experience. Maybe there's part of them, but it's more the social signaling and validation they get when they project that out at a group dinner into a story that they can tell. And that's true for many things. So one of the questions I ask myself with all sorts of things, if I could never talk about this, would I do it?
What a great thing to think about.
Right? Like if I could have, let's just say we didn't know each other, and I was like, okay, I'm earlier in my career. Let's apply some constraints. So I'm not where I am. I still want to do A, B, and C in the public eye. Maybe I want to build a podcast to it. If I could meet with you, but I could never tell a soul, would I do it?
I don't know, would you?
I would. I would. But
I would too.
But for a lot of folks, if they
Meaning I'd meet with you. I'm not saying I'd meet with me, by the way. I'd meet with me. Believe me, I meet with me all the time, and sometimes it's pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, and that can be applied to all sorts of things, right? It's like, and it's a useful question, because I ask myself this for examining your motivations. And I'm not saying one motivation is always better than another, but it's you should at least be aware of your driving motivations, because you can end up playing games you're not even aware you're playing, and that's how you end up, I think, getting into a lot of trouble in life. One of the ways. So that would be a question I might apply. I apply other questions. Like there's a great question that Seth Godin applies, who really I admire tremendously and has built an incredibly unorthodox, unique life for himself and his family. He's zigged when everyone would expect him to zag, and he always has a defensible logic behind it. And much like Derek Sivers, but most people have probably heard the hypothetical question: what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? Right? Or what would you do if you couldn't fail? And Seth turns that around. I think that's a good question. He turns around and said, what would you do if you knew you were going to fail? In terms of identifying what you would do for the process. Right? What would you do if you knew it was going to fail? Okay, you're considering these 5 different projects. Let's say they're all going to fail, but you still have to choose one of the 5. Which would you choose?
That's a great question. Much harder to answer.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm called back to when I was a graduate student, and still now with the podcast, I have this litmus test, which is the experiment that I'm working on the one that I want to be working on most? Is the podcast that I'm working on the one that I want to be working on most? I mean, there's truly no other podcast I'd rather be having today than this one, right? And the moment I'm starting to think, oh, I wish I was doing that thing over there, I realize I'm off target. And I think that asking really good questions is something clearly that you're very good at. And getting a little bit deeper into your process around that, do you write those things down? Like, is there a notebook someplace in the kingdom of Tim Ferriss in Austin or elsewhere that says, those questions that essentially those questions are written? Are they?
Yeah, I collect. I literally have a document with questions that I've gathered from Seth, printed out, and at the Airbnb where I'm staying here. So I
brought it with you.
I printed it out here, and then I went through and I read it last night, and I was highlighting questions from past interviews I've had with him on my podcast to revisit his questions. So I was literally doing that last night, and I collect questions. I collect questions if I am reading a magazine and I come across a good question. I take a photo or I capture it somehow in Notes or in Evernote, which I know is kind of old-fashioned these days, but I've used it for everything. So the critical mass is beyond enormous. And I do collect and revisit these things. I capture them in journals as well, but I absolutely capture good questions when I find them.
Questions are so powerful for the brain. I don't want to go into this in too much detail because I have a lot of questions for you, but we just wrapped a series on mental health that will come out later this year with Paul Conti, and he is brilliant, as we both know, and does truly important work. And he pointed to the value of asking really good questions about oneself, and because of the way that questions that are really directed at self-inquiry cue up the subconscious. So you ask the question, and unlike a statement or a meme, the brain works with that in the days and hours after asking the question in ways that simple declarative statements probably don't ping the system the same way, which is probably why we can see so many points of wisdom and truth everywhere, and it doesn't necessarily transform us, but asking really good questions really does seem to transform us.
Yeah, there's I think judging people by their question is also a shortcut to assessing and learning a lot about how someone functions and what they can pick. It was Voltaire who said, judge a man by his questions, by his answers, something along those lines. But when in doubt, attribute to Voltaire. It sounds good.
Does sound good.
And I think about this a lot. I do think about the questions, and I refine the questions that I ask myself, especially while journaling, because it's easier to cross-examine and stress test your own certainty and beliefs when they are captured on paper or digitally on a laptop, for instance. So I do routinely revisit certain questions that I found helpful over time. I mean, one that people can play with is with whatever is really causing you consternation or stress at the moment, some kind of decision, a relationship, business, could be anything. What might this look like if it were easy? Right? What might this look like? If it were easy, if it had to be easy, if that were possible, what might it look like?
And that could apply to anything.
That could apply to anything. Could apply to fitness. It's like, look, if you do really intense kettlebell swings twice a week with proper weight and load and time under tension, and you do push-ups a few times a week and handle a couple of other elements, you can get in pretty good shape. It's so simple, but
Tricky.
it's a lot. It hits your entire posterior chain. Okay, fine. Do some push-ups and some core work. But if you're not exercising at all because you've made the assumption that it's 4 hours, 5 hours a week, rather than completely remove that objective and call it
Looks can be deceiving.
just impractical, can you ratchet down the scale? How far can you ratchet down the scale until you have no excuses? Right? That'll just be one example. Language learning, tech investing, applies to everything.
Making life easier is something that definitely gets my vote.
Yeah, making it easier and making it more
I
elegant.
use Satan.
Right? The more pieces in your life you have floating around, the more context, the more extraneous loose connections, the harder your life is going to be. The cognitive overload or overhead is really high. So I'm always looking for like Japanese flower arranging. It's like, okay, how many pieces can I remove while still like maintaining the essence of what I'm trying to achieve?
You and Rick Rubin, man, I'm telling you, two people I am fortunate enough to know personally and that I have tremendous respect for, and the work and is self-evident. It's really remarkable. So rewind that and listen to that segment right there, folks. I'm telling you, I've worked hard to apply it because it's not my default, and boy, does it make a significant improvement to simplify. Take some thought and question asking. It's like you just can't delete things at random, so you get down to some fixed number. But I'd like to ask you about another area where you really seem to see around corners, and this is one that actually carried with it significant risk. Not necessarily risk to health and to life, but risk in terms of outside perceptions, and that's psychedelics. As you know, I've substantially changed my view on this. We don't need to go into my former stance on it. I talked about that when you were gracious enough to host me on your podcast for a second time. I'd done some psychedelics recreationally as a kid. It was correlated with not so great times in my life, stayed away from them, then eventually revisited MDMA in particular from a therapeutic standpoint. Found tremendous benefit. Again, therapeutically with a medical doctor. Again, these drugs are illegal. Soon to change, perhaps, hopefully, and we'll talk about that. But it's becoming clear from the controlled studies by Robin Carter Harris, there are many others, okay, Nolan Williams, others, that these drugs have enormous potential to help relieve depression, trauma, help people explore their psyche, their mind, for sake of feeling better, doing better in the world, for leaning into life, not tune in, drop out, but to really lean into life with more purpose and more satisfaction. In some cases, they really have saved lives, I think. What was your mindset around psychedelics when you first started exploring them? What
Patience, someone.
led you to overcome the inevitable, fear gap there? Because you do seem like somebody who takes value in your health, right? You're not reckless. You may have been more adventurous in the past with things like, I hate the word, but biohacking and self-experimentation than you are now, but you obviously have some self-preservation mechanism intact.
We learned.
What was your mindset around it at the time? And then I want to get to what you've learned from it, and frankly, the tremendous efforts that you've put that are now translating to tremendous value for really millions of people. And ultimately, I think it's going to be billions of people by establishing funding for the pioneering research in this area, helping to promote the movement of these compounds from illegal to legal in the therapeutic setting, so on and so on. So take us back to your first thoughtful exploration of psychedelics. What did that look like? You're like, oh, mushrooms, I'll eat them. Was that it? Or was it a dedicated research process? And who'd you talk to? What was it all about?
Let's go way back to my undergrad experience. And for many reasons that I ended up going to Princeton. I think I was very lucky to get in. My SAT scores, I never finished the damn test. I was so much of a perfectionist, I would get stuck and ended up not doing terribly well. But through essays and other things, ultimately was able to go. Part of the draw
let
for
me interrupt you and just say that I think at this point we can say they were lucky to have you.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
Great institution, and you've done great, and you're a great poster on the wall for them.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I hope so.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah, I just want to say it because you're not going to, and I think it's important that these are great institutions and great minds go through there, and Einstein went through there.
Yeah, he did.
And their success rests not just on the Einsteins, but also on the student body and what they go out into the world and do, and not just in the realm of science. So really, they're lucky to have had you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I studied Chinese in a room where Einstein used to teach. It's pretty cool to set foot and spend time weekly in a space that was shared by some of these people.
Amazing.
It really gets the imagination firing. If we go back to that chapter in my life,
Where next?
I was initially a psychology major with focus on neuroscience. So I wanted to be a neuroscientist. And there are many reasons for that. I have neurodegenerative disease on both sides of my family, so Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So that was certainly a personal driving interest in terms of looking at mechanisms, understanding what therapeutics existed or did not exist, how things were developing in the research. And while I was there, which later I ended up switching gears and transferring to focus on language acquisition and East Asian studies, hence the Chinese that I mentioned earlier, and Japanese and Korean. But on the neuroscience side, there were a lot of cool breakthroughs also that came out of Princeton around that time, looking at the amazing discovery of, say, neuronal, I want to say regenesis, but neurogenesis in the hippocampus.
Yeah, Liz Gould's work.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Very
So there was
familiar
quite a
with
bit
that.
happening at that time. I was a subject. I loved volunteering for studies just to try to get an inside look at how things were done in some of Daniel Kahneman's experiments. So it was a cool time to be there. And within the first 2 years, I want to say I had my first experience recreationally with mushrooms. And looking back now, I'm horrified by just the lack of control. I mean, not control, but lack of supervision, right? I mean, the set and setting ended up being fine. Nothing terrible happened, but there were a lot of ways it could have gone sideways. But that first experience, and I must have consumed in retrospect just a dizzying amount of mushrooms. I mean,
It'd be in excess of 5 grams.
it would have been more. Yeah, just knowing what I knew now, it would have been.
Kids don't do this at all.
Don't do that.
I'm not gonna say don't do it at home. Don't do it at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Please,
So-
I actually don't think the young developing brain should be exposed to psychedelics.
We can talk
Well,
about
we
that.
can talk about that.
Yeah,
I'm
we can
going to
talk
take
about
my stance. I'm going to take
Well,
my stance.
I mean,
for now. you
yeah,
know?
I mean, in the world in which we live in the U.S., I would totally agree with you. There are some interesting cultural exceptions in other places where things are more set up to provide for that type of use, but I certainly would not recommend it. But coming back to my recreational experience, my subjective experience was so bizarre, and my experience of time so nonlinear, my experience of self so different from anything I had experienced up to that point. And therefore, my construction of reality being so completely unlike anything I had experienced was enough to make me want to learn about these compounds. And very early on, I still have a scan of it somewhere. I think it was in 1998 or 99. I actually wrote a paper. One of my junior papers was focused on examining potential similarities between REMC and LSD. And looking at some of the patterns of neural activity. Of course, we can do a lot more now with the tools that we have available. But from a scientific perspective, I was very curious about how much we knew and how much we didn't know. And I would say that latter category gets me more excited in a way. And I'm like, okay, how much room is there for growth here? Right? Because if we're just putting on the finishing touches with marginal, incremental improvements on something that we feel like we've largely figured out, that's less interesting to me than something that baffles most people examining them on some level. And there was a professor named Barry Jacobs who was doing some very interesting work. He did a lot of work looking at the serotonergic systems and did a lot of work with cats. Ultimately, I could not do personally the animal work required of the sort of indentured servitude that I would.
I think you wrote someplace once. You said when confronted with the prospect of installing a computer printer into the head of a
printer
cat,
jack on the back of a cat head.
on the back of a cat head.
They literally had those those little VGA ports on the back of these cats' heads because cats sleep a lot, and so they're interesting to study.
A lot of that. Cats. Very few laboratories work on cats any longer. It's mostly mouse. Still some non-human primate work. My laboratory is essentially shut down, or is in the process of shutting down. Even our mouse work. I much prefer to work on humans. They can give consent and they house themselves. And the animal research thing is tough for any sentient being. It's tough.
The cat, for what it's worth, the cats seemed pretty happy. Like they were just sleeping. I mean, the ports were for tracking, so the cats were pretty. I mean, they were just normal cats. The cats were fine, but we would have been injecting retroviruses into rats and then perfusing them, which means bleeding them to death, to avoid bruising of the tissue. Because then, if you're going to take thin slices and scans, you didn't want to have bruising. And I just couldn't. I think it's important. I do think there's a place for it, but I couldn't do it. So that's why I transferred out. But the point I was trying to make is that I had the experience, and then I had that drive the scientific interest. And then I had probably one experience per year for a few years after that. And what I noticed for myself personally, because I suffered from major depressive disorder and extended depressive episodes, let's just say on average 3 to 4 a year. And by extended,
Even before you had started.
even
all of
before,
this.
yeah.
From a young age.
yeah, completely. And I would say, so let's just call it 3 to 4 on average a year. Those could last each a few weeks or a few months. I mean, this is a very high percentage of my total year. And when I had these higher dose experiences with with mushrooms, so we're talking about psilocybe mushrooms, and then if we're looking at the molecule that's being examined scientifically, psilocybin, I noticed this afterglow effect that was really durable, and that was an antidepressant effect, or a mood elevating effect, that lasted far longer than the half-life could explain, right? Because it's 4 to 6 hours, you're kind of on the other side, and I would experience this afterglow effect for 3 to 6 months. And that raised all sorts of interesting questions. What the hell is going on here? Is it the content? Is it some structural change? There were a lot of unanswered questions for me. And then I had a very, very scary experience that led me to completely stop using psychedelics. Again, uncontrolled environment. I was in rural New York, coming out of my trip, standing in the middle of the road in the middle of the night with headlights coming at me.
Goodness gracious.
So you don't want to do that. And I was like, okay, it's dangerous.
Were you taking them alone? Is that how
I
that
was
is?
taking them with 2 friends, and my 2 friends, without telling me, just went for a walk, left me alone. So don't
Well,
do
it
that.
points to these are powerful compounds.
Yeah,
And,
you're playing with nuclear power. Like this is the nuclear power of like psychological or psycho-emotional surgery is the way I encourage people to think about them. And I stopped using any psychedelics completely. I was still very interested in them, but I basically hit pause. And I didn't revisit that until, let's call it 2012, 2013, where I was still struggling with major depressive disorder. And I saw my girlfriend at the time completely transformed by supervised, facilitated use of, in this case, ayahuasca, which was not quite as common as it is in conversation at the time. And she did that in South America, but she not only explained her experience, but I was able to see the transformation in her that seemed to have some durability over time. And that is when I started stepping back into researching psychedelics, looking at what had been published in the last, let's just call it 10 years, as of that point in time, and thinking about how I would approach it systematically with safeguards, with proper supervision, and basically approaching it the way I would have approached any of the topics in the 4-Hour Body. And that is what led me back into, along with a number of other interventions, I should say. So I wasn't betting the farm on psychedelics. I also started TM at that point. I was
You just, some people might, transcendental meditation. These are like 4 to 10 day meditation retreats.
This was actually much shorter. It was a 2 or 3 day training, and you're visiting an instructor, I want to say it's once or twice a day, probably once a day, and getting up to speed. And I did this because I was going through a period of acute stress. This was finishing the 4-hour chef. This was actually probably in years preceding that. And I had one friend who I'd seen really change from, let's just call hyperkinetic, high anxiety to low anxiety. And he said, you have the time, you have the money, pay for the course, just take it. Yes, there are all these criticisms of TM. Yes, there are all these weird historical anecdotes of people trying to levitate and all this weirdness. Just ignore that.
Well, trying to levitate,
Yeah,
nothing against that. If you
yeah.
actually levitate, then we got to have a discussion.
Yeah,
But trying
yeah.
to levitate seems like
Why not?
every kid tries all sorts of things.
Give it a go. He's like, just put that aside, because I kept coming up with pushback. And he's like, all I'm saying is it's like a warm bath for your mind. You take twice a day and it'll chill you the fuck out. So try it. And I was like, okay, fine.
It's a good endorsement.
I was like, at this point, I had been burning the candle at both ends so intensely. It's like, okay. So there was TM, and then I began examining how I might approach. Notice I didn't just jump into using them. I was like, how could I approach taking psychedelics in a sequence, in a logical sequence, with proper protections, with safety assurances? And that took me probably a month or 2, and I was right in the middle of it. Northern California has access to a lot. And only then did I start looking at having my own experiences. And lo and behold, I mean, I'll touch and chase, but the personal outcome, and there are many different benefits and risks. I should make it very clear that these things can be extremely dangerous in certain ways. Generally not physiologically, but they can be dangerous. I would say instead of 3 to 4 times per year on average, I probably have 1 depressive episode every 2 years.
It's a significant improvement.
Right. I mean, from a quality of life perspective, those are 2 different people. And that then led me to, and as I did with all my workouts, right, I took copious notes over the span. I mean, now we're looking at 10 plus years. So if I were to ever write another book, it would probably be related to all of the really fine details of the experiments and my learnings, including some of the more bizarre things over the last 10 years. But it would be just a beast to create. So
with psychedelics, experiences with psychedelics,
and sort of psychedelic adjacent, non-ordinary experiences of consciousness, which I think often are touching at edges of the same thing, which is going to be controversial for some folks. But to come back to the storyline, just to put a bow on that, when I saw the personal outcomes for me, the anecdata from friends who are facilitators who have worked with thousands of people, right, which is a pretty good sample size. Still anecdote, but these are people who are very smart, who keep records. And I believe that these people have spotted patterns that are only going to be possible to test and verify over the next 5 to 10 years. So I at least as a means of generating hypotheses, I take these people very seriously. And then I started to connect with scientists whose work I had read, like Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, began looking at the most compelling data related to, say, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and complex PTSD.
Would I lie?
I made the commitment to myself that as soon as I had enough money to move the dial, because I really felt like these tools were so outside of the normal paradigm of psychiatry and pharmacology, and that made me very excited because it was uncrowded, there was very little funding coming into the space, it was high leverage, and I looked at it just as I've looked at my many startup investments. Limited downside risk, really high upside potential. And I should say before that, I'd already been funding in a very small way science. So the first check I ever wrote was personally to Adam Ghazali's lab at UCSF.
Yeah, great lab.
Which at the time was looking at software. He's not going to like this description, but I'm going to simplify it. Software that might attenuate or reverse age-related cognitive impairment, specifically related to various aspects of attention. And that was my first foray into funding early stage science, which was very analogous to me to funding early stage startups. And then later on, to touch on the reputational thing, I know this is a TED Talk, so thank you for listening.
No, this is great. Please, you're always so gracious on your podcast. This is what people want.
Yeah.
This is certainly what I want to hear. So,
So on the reputational side, you're right that at the time, especially, let's just call it 2013 to 2015, this was not a comfortable national conversation at any time.
yeah, I wouldn't have had this conversation back then.
No way.
I'd lose. I don't know that I would have lost my job. It just would have raised a lot of eyebrows. But now such studies are happening.
The perception was that these are a professional third rail, at the very least, right? Also illegal, therefore, if I talk about them, am I giving someone probable cause? Am I going to get myself in some type of really tricky legal situation, et cetera? There are a lot of considerations. But I tested that. Just like I was saying, I like to capture my assumptions on paper so I can stress test. And I was like, okay, I think that might be true. Most people I know think that is true. But is it true? How could we test to see if that is true or not? And I decided to crowdfund for a Hopkins pilot study looking at psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And I thought to myself, okay, we have a couple of things falling in our favor here. Number one, depression does not discriminate. So across socioeconomic classes, across gender, across race, this is a problem.
I use
Almost everyone knows someone who takes antidepressants who's still depressed. Okay. Treatment-resistant depression, therefore, is the indication. Psilocybin is the intervention. Let me crowdfund, and I did that through at the time CrowdRise, which was co-founded by Edward Norton, who had become a friend and was
The actor,
the actor, who's very smart. Also, investor very bright guy. And so crowdfunded, and I also like to put my money where my mouth is. So I said, okay, guys, I'm going to seed this. I'm putting in X. The goal is to raise, I think it was 80,000, something like that, for the following study. And then I was like, let's see what happens. And there was basically zero negative blowback. And not only was there no discernible negative blowback, a number of people, and this was deliberate, I wanted to see this, a number of people came out of the woodwork to support in a bigger way. And I was like, oh, okay, I see you. A handful of folks I knew, and I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, there are at least a half a dozen folks who are studying the same thing or paying attention to the same thing. And then I just got bolder. I was like, okay, if I tested that, let me push, and then let's see what happens, and I'll wait. And lo and behold, I realized that the perception did not match the reality. The reality was, if you're talking about indications that cause an incredible amount of suffering for a very large number of people, even those who are anti-drug per se, just say no to drugs, want solutions. And the current treatments for many of these things do not work very well. And in the best of cases, are often masking symptoms and not addressing root causes, I would say. So at that point, I just went whole hog and I said, okay, look, I like to think that I'm exactly what you see is what you get, right? The person you talk to off camera, the person you talk to on camera, same. And if I start feeling like I have too much to protect, I want to do something to counteract that. In other words, if I feel like I need to censor my true feelings and beliefs, maybe not share my hardships, perhaps not promote certain things because I have a reputation to lose, that's a fragile position. I want to be as anti-fragile as possible. And so by talking about this, I viewed it as a way of inoculating myself against the fear of reputation loss. Like, okay, let me push this. Like, I'll ride this horse. Other people might not, but I wanted to remove the stigma for funding purposes, hopefully open up federal funding. That's starting to happen now from different agencies. And then to focus on access and reduction of cost and insurance reimbursement and so on. So I set a game plan, let's call it maybe 5 years ago, and I've just been slowly, methodically executing on that since. And the reason I chose this to focus on, and I've funded other things, but I've really focused on this, mental health therapeutics, which is not limited to psychedelics. And I've talked about some other things that I find interesting, but psychedelics are, like I said, what makes it attractive. Very uncrowded. You can do a lot with a small amount of money, unlike, say, cancer research. It's very hard. Like, okay, you're a decabillionaire, great. Maybe you can do something interesting. And I'm sure other people could, but if you have $20,000, $50,000, it's going to be hard to make a dent there. And psychedelics, you can actually still make a difference. And very high leverage in part because these compounds seem to challenge much of what we assume to be true about treating mental health. And so that makes for an attractive bet.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that with us and that you did that exploration and that you've been spearheading the funding efforts. This podcast has a premium channel that's for raising funds for scientific studies. We are in the process now making our first 4 contributions. One of those includes work in Nolan Williams' laboratory at Stanford to combine transcranial magnetic stimulation with studies of ibogaine and 5-MeO, DMT, maybe a few other things, but basically that he's free to do what he wants with the funds. We trust him to do great work. But that, again, was inspired by you, right? A podcast with a scientific slant, certainly. This podcast obviously has a scientific slant, but the idea of doing philanthropy for the sorts of work that really deserves funding and exploration. And by the way, in thinking about other hybrid things that would be fun to do, I mean, I would love to contribute and join those efforts, because the work to continue to raise funding for psychedelic studies and all these great laboratories continues, right?
It continues.
Yeah, and you've rallied a collection of some pretty powerful people to contribute to this. And I know you've joined arms with Michael Pollan in many ways. Do you want to talk about the fellowships that you guys put together? I find that really cool. You've got fellowships in the works or maybe already happening at UC Berkeley. Is that right?
At UC Berkeley, yeah. So what I try to do, and for people who want to check it out, it's the name of the foundation is SciSay Foundation. And let me explain that for a second. So it's SAISEI, so SciSayFoundation.org. I speak Japanese. I went there as an exchange student and speak, read, and write it still to this day pretty well. Saisei can mean a lot of things. It means rebirth in Japanese. And I've seen what can only be described, or can certainly be described as rebirth in so many clinical outcomes that I thought it was appropriate to use. And what I've tried to do with the foundation is, I think, do what I'm pretty good at, which is trying to peek around corners and find something to prototype, right? So just like the CGM, and like, all right, how can I, just getting a hold of a Dexcom back then when it was just for type 1 diabetics was hard. It was
Isn't this thing that you have to actually go under the skin? So
it's like taking a barbecue prong and putting it under your abdominal skin. It was not comfortable.
Can you describe your cortisol level in subjective terms when you're at home? You got this thing and you're about to implant it, and you don't have any precedent. It's not like this is, like Levels or one of these other CGMs that are out there. You stamp the thing in, you can look on Instagram and see someone else do it. There's nothing like that. So you're at home wondering if you're going to skewer your liver.
Yeah, I'm at home doing it myself, and I'm sweating like a stuck pig. I'm sitting there, I'm like, my God, I don't even know if I can.
Is your girlfriend there, like, to support you in case you die?
I think at the time she wasn't, because she was squeamish and didn't want to see it. And I'm sitting there at my kitchen table. I remember this. God, I'm sweating just thinking about it. And no videos to watch. And wasn't really supposed to have it in the first place. And the device for readout, by the way, no iPhone, right?
Right.
So it's like this janky pager-looking thing that had a readout that made you think you were playing Pong or something. It was very
the green tint screen.
Yeah, green tint screen.
Dot font.
It was so primitive. And put this thing under my skin with tape. I would cut a Ziploc bag and put it on top and masking tape it to my skin to take showers, because otherwise it wouldn't work. And it was great. And I'll just say that I don't use a CGM.
It was great. You realize you said it was great.
I did say it was great because
I'm sweating and I was afraid.
But it gave me a lot of insight.
Okay.
And then once I had the insight over a course of a couple of weeks, then I felt like I didn't really need it anymore. And that was also just a heavy tax. Okay? You have to wear that thing around. Look like a, what is it called, plastic bag or something. Yeah. And it was just like, it was big. It was bulky. So just like I did that, I wanted to do proof of concept, right? The goal was, can I use this for healthy, normal applications? Will the insights be actionable? And they were, lo and behold. Similarly with the foundation, since I'm dealing with smaller amounts of money, I'm not in the billionaire club by any stretch of the imagination, and science can be expensive, I'm looking for small bets. Where can I pilot something that, if successful, will be emulated or can be scaled? And so in the crowdfunding for the Hopkins treatment-resistant depression pilot study, we ended up exceeding the goal. They were able to recruit more subjects. In the case of UC Berkeley, Michael Pollan and I partnered on this, and my foundation funded it. The Ferris UC Berkeley Journalism Fellowship, Psychedelic Journalism Fellowship, is providing funding to up-and-coming journalists who want to focus on psychedelics as their beat, which, to this date, has not been financially feasible. You just don't have the space to do really long-form investigative work. The hope being that these journalists can apply their skills and their dedication to examine different facets of the psychedelic ecosystem, therapeutic potential, regulatory issues, etc., in a way that can shape and inform national and international thinking in a very critical way. Because these are not a panacea. There's a lot of things that are made about these that are totally unbacked by any type of science, and there are a lot of charlatans. And so I wanted to also invite really competent, really good journalists to the table who might want to watch for bad actors. I think that's really important. And so this fellowship has been awarding fellows with these grants. And I think it's a relatively small amount of money. It's like $10,000 per, something like that. But the outcomes have been amazing. We had a huge, I want to say it was 7,000 word piece that was one of the main features in Rolling Stone magazine. Huge piece in National Geographic focused on iboga and fair trade and some of the implications for local harvesting and or over-harvesting, all the dynamics present in that, which I think has some incredible promise for particular forms of opioid use disorder in particular. But that has been a huge success. So the hope is that other journalism schools will say that's a great idea. And I will have de-risked it for some other philanthropist or foundation or government, say director of an agency, to say, okay, we'll greenlight that. Right? Because I've done it and it's been received very well. And it's had a real impact on how things are moving along. Another one would be, say, at Harvard Poplar. This is at Harvard Law School. It's the first dedicated team focused on law, policy, and regulation related to psychedelics from a legal perspective.
Super important.
Super important. Also, another pilot, let's just call it proof of concept that Sesame Foundation funded, was helping to develop curricula for, I think it was Yale, Johns Hopkins, and NYU, effectively an accreditation or module they could put into their existing psychiatry MD programs such that people could develop the skills necessary and the understanding necessary to administer psychedelic-assisted therapies if and when they become legal, prescribable.
Which, if I understand correctly, it sounds like within the next 12 to 24 months, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of trauma is likely to become legal in the hands of psychiatrists, at least, and maybe certain clinical psychologists as well in the U.S. Is that right? That was through the efforts of the MAPS group.
Yeah, through the efforts of MAPS.org and Rick Doblin and many others. That is the tip of the spear. So I think anyone who's interested in psychedelics should have a vested interest in supporting those efforts. Not because we know everything works. I want to be clear. Not because we know a priori that all of these things do all the things. No. But if MDMA fails, it's going to be very hard to draft. It'll be impossible to draft on that with compounds that are more difficult to administer, like psilocybin, which would be next in line for alcohol use disorder, also. So I really feel that just like everything I've talked about, whether it's networking, putting together the 4-hour body, or trying to change national policy and, say, reclassification of these compounds, getting them out of Schedule 1 to some extent. You want to break it down into its constituent pieces. You want to do an 80-20 analysis, figure out what the critical few are, and then put them in a logical sequence and execute the plan. One of the greatest weaknesses in the psychedelic ecosystem is there are a lot of people who just want to do all the things and save all the people and all the animals and all the places all at once. And that just doesn't work very well. There are also some really good people who are executing. And we can talk about that. But I've been very, very, very pleased with the outcomes that Psy Foundation has been able to achieve with very limited money. I'm prouder of those outcomes than I am of the startup record. The startup record's pretty good. And it's the same lens. I'm using the same filters, the same thing. It's kind of what I'm always looking for. I'm looking for stuff that will translate across fields, if possible. And then you mentioned one, TMS. I think TMS, very interesting.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Yeah, which at one point was more commonly used to inhibit specific brain areas. This is a non-invasive technique. I've had it done where it's over my motor cortex and you're tapping your finger and all of a sudden you can't tap your fingers. It's pretty eerie, but now it can be used to stimulate at particular frequencies, enhance neuroplasticity. And in combination with psychedelics it's kind of the burning question now. Can you get a synergistic effect of TMS and psychedelics? Maybe not just during the psilocybin or iboga journey, but in the days and weeks after, when we know for sure a lot of plasticity is still occurring. So keep the plasticity on board or accelerate it.
Yeah, so TMS also is monotherapy, very interesting to me for depression, anxiety, even substance use disorders, super interesting. And there are many different protocols, all sorts of different technology. I would say low intensity or low power ultrasound, also super interesting for various applications, potentially to addiction. So I'm not, to be clear, a card-carrying evangelist for psychedelics. I am a proponent of looking for high leverage, uncrowded bets with limited downside and testing them out. And very optimistic about psychedelics. If anyone listening has a family history of, say, schizophrenia or a personality disorder, which this is being very simplistic, but categorize and describe as more chaotic conditions compared to hyper-rigid conditions like an OCD or anorexia nervosa, chronic depression, etc. And we could talk about why some of these psychedelics, these classical psychedelics, seem to have cross-efficacy with multiple conditions, but psychedelics seem very helpful for certain types of hyper-rigidity. When you get into schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder, they can be really heavily contraindicated. Not to say that they cause those conditions, but they can precipitate the onset of those symptoms, and for that reason can be very destabilizing and dangerous for certain people. However, that's where something like metabolic psychiatry comes in, and the use of ketosis and the ketogenic diet, which appears to be very effective in some patients for that grouping of, say, more chaotic conditions, which is very exciting. So I'm interested in any tools that are offered that seem to raise interesting questions that have not been answered in a satisfying way yet in medicine. And I think we're still largely in the dark ages with respect to psychiatry.
Oh, I think the best psychiatrists would agree with you.
Yeah, and the best psychiatrists and the best scientists and the best fill in the blank are acutely aware of the limitations of our current methods and the limitations of our current knowledge. So I think the mark of a good thinker, the mark of a good scientist, the mark of a good fill in the blank anything is someone who says, I have no idea, or we have no idea, a lot.
And hopefully they also say, let's go figure it out or try some things. And I really want to thank you for sharing that narrative, especially because it makes clear that you brought the same systematic process of using and asking excellent questions to arrive at solutions, to arrive at more questions, to fund areas of inquiry, and to do it all in this really structured way. As you said, from policy all the way down to like how many grams or X of some substance somebody might take. I mean, I think Matthew Johnson's laboratory at Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, Robin Cardart-Harris at UCSF, Nolan Williams, the MAPS group, Rick Doblin,
Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama looking at cocaine addiction, other things.
Yeah, you, Michael Pollan. I'm leaving some names out here, and I don't want to take anything away from the classic, as they're called, explorers of psychedelics and writers about psychedelics. But we are in the moment of a renaissance now, and it's important that this have a lot of fuel. So we'll put a link to your philanthropy efforts and the journalism fellowships as well, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest there, and I'm a huge supporter of what you're doing, as you know, and I just think it's the way great science and clinical progress is made. So
thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, it's which brings me to another parallel topic. It used to be that meditation and psychedelics were nested in the same territory. This would be in the late 60s, early 70s, the birth of places like Esalen, et cetera, with the consequence of the dual exploration of those things. Meditation sort of escaped from the psychedelics umbrella and vice versa, starting sometime in the mid-2000s when neuroimaging became a little bit more accessible. And, I think nowadays if you told anybody, okay, meditation's good for you. It can help ratchet down your anxiety, give more self-awareness, improve sleep, and on, maybe even give some insight into consciousness. No one's going to balk. There's just a lot of studies. There's thousands of studies. My laboratory's done a few of them. There are other laboratories who've done far more. The book Altered Traits is the one that comes to mind. A group out of Wisconsin was early to the game on this. In any event, you talked about TM. I'm curious from a practical standpoint, do you still meditate daily? Do you do meditation retreats? what sorts of meditative practices do you have? Because I realize this can be done, walking, writing is its own form of meditation. What sorts of formal practices do you still engage in now?
Yeah, I do 10 to 20 minutes in the morning. So I am not currently doing the TM twice daily, 20 minutes. I think that would be better for me, probably.
Do you set a clock and you...
Yeah, I'll set a clock, which would be more of the concentration practice of, say, a TM where you're repeating a mantra. Honestly, it could be any, in my opinion, some TM purists will balk at this, but it could be really any nonsense syllable. It could be a word, although I think something without any attached meaning is probably more beneficial for a host of reasons. So it could be a concentration practice with 20 minutes of sitting. It might also be a guided meditation, and I have no vested interest in this app, but I think the Waking Up app by Sam Harris is fantastic.
As do I.
I have used the introductory course, which is Sam leading you through My Catnip, which is a logical progression of skill development from day 1, 2, 3, and forward. I have gone through that course multiple times when I'm getting back on the horse for meditation as a bit of a reboot. Once you develop, I think, a certain degree of awareness and mindfulness, I do think there are other activities that probably allow you the parallel experience of doing one thing while experiencing some of the benefits of meditation. And so for me, I wonder at times, are the benefits of meditation, the concentration practice itself, is it just sitting still with my eyes closed, down-regulating my system a little bit, activating my parasympathetic, and not rushing or doing anything for 20 minutes? Is that it? Maybe. Is it simply correcting my posture for 20 minutes? How do I weight these different inputs? And the short answer is you probably don't need to know, but I have found that spending time in silence in nature without anything to do, disallowing myself from doing things, no note-taking, no reading, etc. And I have spent a number of extended fasts in nature, water only by myself, no talking, no reading, no writing.
What's extended?
7 days, generally.
Wow. So you're camping in nature with just water.
Yep, that's it, by myself. And there are risks associated with that, right? You got to be careful, not stupid about it. But that does a lot for me with some persistent benefits.
Are there some favorite places that you've gone into nature? It doesn't have to be to fast. Like, for instance, I'm a big fan of some of the national parks up in the Pacific Northwest because it's like being transported to a different planet. Yosemite's obviously amazing, but any favorite spots where people won't go looking for you there? Don't worry.
Yeah,
You live in Austin all the time. So
that's right. Yeah, so I would say Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, spending time in mountains, around rivers, lakes, I find very therapeutic. Just gorgeous. I do think we suffer from awe deficiency disorder, a bit of ADD when we're trapped in the mundane for too long with too much distraction, with too many to-dos, with too many relationships. And there's no space for awe there. There isn't the room necessary. Awe isn't, in my perspective, generally equipped with the EPI and the things that you do. There's more being required for doing it than saying it. So I try to, on a yearly basis, top priority to lock out these weeks of time in nature.
Last year was the first year I did that. I went out to Colorado in August and just took daily hikes. I stayed in a hotel. I'm not as beastie as you doing water fast. I was eating every day, but it was spectacular. One thing I noticed, and I'd like to know your process on, how do you handle going back into life?
Great question.
Because those days were and are amazing, right? You're like detached and, maybe one text message here or there, or in between hikes or something, and then you just really clued in. Even the process of watching a show at night, like one felt so rich and like enough. So I wasn't as aesthetic as you, and like to really clean all the clutter. But once you return to life, it's almost like being awash in demands, and I can see from a place of more equanimity how one could make better choices. But how do you handle those transitions in re-entry?
Yeah. So before getting to the entry, I think it might make sense for me to talk about what comes before. So let's say it's like pre, during, post. Part of the reason I do these 1 week or longer periods off the grid is because it forces me to put better systems in place. So there's the benefit that you derive from, say, that week. And I have 3 weeks coming up right after this interview where I'm going to be off the grid. To set myself up for 3 weeks off the grid, I have a team, I have the podcast, I have a lot of things that are in motion at any given point in time. If you disappear for, say, a 2 to 4 week period, generally you cannot let the whole house catch on fire, then come back and put it out effectively, which means you need to put some policies and rules and so on in place in advance. And there's a carryover effect that has a host of benefits and makes things smoother for the reentry, so they're related. Like the more you set up the pre, the easier the post is going to be. And then you have this beautiful, expansive experience in nature, whatever it might be, whether you're making it a supper fest like I do, or at a hotel at night. Either way, these things can work, and nature in and of itself is super helpful. I do think that a lot of the time we like to imagine, because we're driven, smart, accomplished people, that our problems are very complex. And at the end of the day, it's like you just need some time in nature and a cold shower and some fucking macadamia nuts, and you'll be fine. You don't need to solve like all the existential dilemmas of humankind, actually, or fancy pharmaceuticals. So you have this experience over this week, and what I will do then is set at least a, let's call it, integration period of 2 to 3 days where I will slowly edge back in to my previous routine. I will not, within 12 hours of getting back to so-called civilization, have a day full of calls or meetings. I will not do that. It's too much of a shock to the system, and I think it robs you of a tail end of benefits, which would also be the case with, say, fast or ketogenic diet or any number of interventions. You can squeeze out a long tail of benefits if you make a handful of changes. For instance, after an extended fast, what if you started with a subcaloric ketogenic diet for a few days? You get to extend some of the benefits as opposed to going straight back to, say, a diet that includes a lot of carbohydrates. Similarly, when you create more of a vacuum, more space for awe, insight, reflection, recovery, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you jump from park into sixth gear. And so I plan for that. And it's a function of scheduling. I also have a predictable weekly schedule. So I tend to schedule podcast recordings on Mondays and Fridays. In preparation for an extended trip, I will batch a lot of similar activities that we have, say, a bunch of episodes in the bank that are pre-scheduled. Everything is figured out in advance. And over time, the more you take these breaks, the better your systems become, and the more liberated you are from the day-to-day, which means when you get back, you also don't need to rush as much into hyperactivity. And if you do, you know that that is more from a compulsivity than from a necessity.
While you're on these nature retreats, are you writing on a daily basis? Or are you just thinking and allowing thoughts to enter and leave your system?
Depends on the retreat. So sometimes I'm writing, but writing, I think, can underscore for me a desire to be compulsively productive. And I think that is inversely correlated to my happiness or sense of well-being a lot of the time. So there are many areas in my life now. So if you were to ask me what has changed significantly since the time you wrote For Our Body, I would say that rather than looking for areas to optimize, I am looking where I can very deliberately de-optimize certain areas to increase sense of well-being. Where can I de-optimize? Where can I stop measuring? Where can I stop reading books? Which areas can I ignore completely? What types of information can I just excise from my life altogether for a period of time? Delete Twitter. Stop reading about books in X related to, say, AI or whatever it might be. Like, where can I de-optimize selectively to sort of optimize the whole? Does that make sense?
Makes good sense, yeah.
And before we started recording, I gave you a book, which is a short collection of poetry by Halaliza Ghafouri, which is called Gold. It's a collection of Rumi poetry. Reading poetry is an activity almost by definition, which is the antithesis of optimization. So I've tried to also integrate more of those activities into my life. And this relates to your question, because there are times when I will just force myself to sit on my goddamn hands and not write, not read. Just do the thing that is so uncomfortable sometimes, which is just sitting there with yourself.
It can be incredibly uncomfortable, and in part because of the fear that it could become comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Especially for proactive people with a strong, well, to use Paul Conti's words, generative drive. You're gonna. That's which is a good thing. I believe
it's a good thing, and it can be a good thing. It can indicate really incredible adaptations. It can also sometimes, I think, indicate maladaptations, right? And so I think it's helpful to take a break from that generative drive, or at least just put it in park position to see if that generative drive is perhaps indicative of you leaning towards something in a healthy, proactive way versus running from something in a long-term destructive way.
Yeah. Well, and I think Paul would say that part of the generative drive process is peace. Not as necessarily even as a still state, but as a, being able to experience peace even in the transitions. And there's a lot more to say about that. And he would say it far better than I ever would. So I'll leave it at that. And
I mean, for people who have the option, getting in nature, it doesn't have to be all day, every day on a water fast. I just take certain things to an extreme because that's who I am. But
sorry, when you say water fast, that means fasting with water.
Right. It just
Fasting, but yes, drinking water.
It just means you're allowed to have water and nothing else.
For a long time, I thought it meant that you're not drinking water.
Oh yeah, no, don't do that.
Some people do that, right? They do these crazy food water fasts as a way. I think they believe it clears senescent cells or something, but probably clears a lot more than just senescent cells.
Yeah, there might be something to it. I mean, look, there are people who recycle by drinking their own urine, not my jam. But I would say it's like 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. General rule of thumb. So be careful with dehydration. You can go a long time without food.
Let's get right to the point, shall we? Is JavaScript's garbage collector as bad as some people think it is? I have no idea.
You're going to see someone else do it. There's nothing like that. So you're wondering if you're going to skewer your liver.
Yeah, I'm doing it myself, and led me to, and as I did with all my workouts, right? So I really felt like these tools very relevant. And so crowdfunding applications cause incredible amounts of support for a very large number of people. Even those who are anti-drug per se, they say no drugs, lots of solutions. And the current treatments for many of these things do not work very well. And in best of cases, often massive symptoms of not addressing, executing on that since the name of the foundation is SICE.
No one Williams operates ever to combine.
And I've funded other things, but I've really focused on this mental health therapeutics, which is not limited to psychedelics. But psychedelics are, like I said, related to attractive. Highly important because these compounds seem to challenge much of what we assume to be true about treating mental health. And that makes very happy.
So glad you did that with us and that you did that exploration and that you've been spearheading the funding efforts. This podcast has a premium channel that's for raising funds for scientific studies. We are in the process of now making our first 4 contributions. One of those includes working Nolan Williams Laboratory at Stanford, combining transcranial magnetic stimulation with studies of ibogaine and 5-MeO, DMT, maybe a few other things. But basically, that keeps really wants with funds. We trust him to do great work. But that again was inspired by you, right? A podcast with a scientific slant. Certainly, this podcast obviously has a scientific slant, but the idea of doing philanthropy for the sort of work that really deserves funding and exploration. And by the way, I'm thinking about other hybrid things that we fund to do. I mean, I would love to contribute and join those efforts. The work to continue to raise funding for psychedelic studies and all these great laboratories continues, right? And you rally a collection of some pretty powerful people to contribute this. I know you joined arms with Michael Pollan in many ways. Do you want to talk about fellowships? Sure. I find that really cool. You've got fellowships in the works or maybe already happening at UC Berkeley.
So just like I did that, I wanted to prove concept. The goal was, can I use this for healthy normal applications? Will the insights be actionable? And they work. Well, similarly with the foundation, since I'm dealing with smart, I'm not a billionaire by any stretch of imagination. And I'm looking to talk about why is the tip of the spear. So I think anyone who's interested in psychedelics, I'm backed by any type of science, and they're watching. And so I want to also invite really good list of people who might want to watch for bad actors. That's really important. And it's been amazing. We have patients for forms of opioid use, opioid disorder, or government. Super important. Also, another pilot, which is called proof of concept that Foundation funded, was helping develop curriculum for Yale, Johns Hopkins, and NYU. Effectively, an accreditation module that put into their existing psychiatry MD programs, such that people could develop the skills necessary and the understanding necessary to administer psychedelic systems if and when they become legal, prescribable. Which, if I understand correctly, sounds like within the next 12 to 24 months, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of trauma is likely to become legal in the hands of psychiatrists, at least, and maybe certain clinical psychologists as well. In the U.S., is that right? Through the efforts of the masters, through the efforts of Oregon, with Dublin, and the others. That is the tip of the spear. So I think anyone who's interested in psychedelics should have a vested interest in supporting those efforts. Not because we know everything works. I want to be clear. Not because we know a priori that all these things do all of this. No. But if MDMA fails, it's very hard to graft. It's impossible to graft on that with compounds that are more difficult to administer, like psilocybin, which is next one, or alpha. So I really feel that just like everything is talked about, whether it's networking, putting together with our body, or trying to change national policy and say reclassification of these compounds out of Schedule 1 to some extent. You want to break it down into its constituent pieces. You want to do the analysis, figure out what the critical few are, bring along the best experts. One of the greatest weaknesses in psychedelic ecosystem is there are a lot of people who just want to do all the things and say all the people and all the elements and all the places all at once. And that just doesn't work well. There are also I've been very, very, very pleased with the outcomes that Sci Foundation was able to achieve. I'm very, very proud. I'm prouder than I was when I started. Pretty good. And staying there and even saying things that kind of almost looks different. And then you mentioned TMS very concerning magnetic stimulation. Yeah, which at one point was more commonly used to inhibit specific brain areas. This is a non-invasive technique had it done where you over motor cortex and tapping your fingernails and you can't tap your fingers. It's pretty eerie, but now can use to stimulate the frequencies and enhance neuroplasticity. And in combination with psychedelics is the kind of brain question now can you get a synergistic effect of TMS and psychedelics. Maybe not just during the psilocybin or iboga journey, but in the days and weeks after when we know for sure a lot of plasticity is still occurring. To keep the plasticity on board or accelerate it. Yeah, so TMS also monotherapy, very interesting for depression, anxiety, even substance use disorders, super interesting. And there are many different protocols, all sorts of different technology. I would say low intensity or low power ultrasound, also super interesting for various applications, potential prediction. So I'm not, to be clear, a card-carrying evangelist for psychedelics. I am a proponent. Say a 2 to 4 week period. Generally, you cannot let the whole house over the week. And what I will do then is set at least a let's call it integration period of 2 to 3 days where I will slowly edge back in to my previous routine. I will not, within 12 hours of getting back to so-called civilization, have a day full of calls meetings. I will not do that. It's too much of a shock to the system. And I think robs you of the tail end benefits. It can also be the case with, say, fast food diet or any number of interventions. You can squeeze out a long tail of benefits and make a handful of changes. For instance, after intermittent fast, what if you started with these nature retreats? Are you writing on a daily basis? In the bank that pre-scheduled everything's read down. And over time, the more you take these breaks, the better your systems become, and the more liberated you are from the daily routine, and you get back to all the things that brush your butt. You know that is more from a compulsivity. While you're on the fast, what if you started with a subcaloric ketogenic diet for a few days? You get to extend some of the benefits as opposed to going straight back to, say, a diet that includes low carbohydrates. Similarly, when you create more of a vacuum, more space for awe, insight, reflection, recovery, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you jump from heart into 6th gear. And so I plan for that. And it's a function of scheduling. I also have a predictable weekly schedule, so I tend to schedule podcast recordings on Mondays and Fridays. In preparation for an extended trip, I will batch a lot of similar activities. So you have, say, a bunch of episodes in the bank that are pre-scheduled everything's read down. And over time, the more you take these breaks, the better your systems become, and the more liberated you are from the daily routine, and you get back to all the things that brush your butt. You know that is more from a compulsivity. While you're on these nature retreats, are you writing on a daily basis or are you just thinking and allowing thoughts to enter into your system? Depends on the retreat. So sometimes I'm writing, but writing I think can underscore for me a desire to be compulsively productive. And I think that is inversely correlated to my happiness or sense of well-being a lot of the time. So there are many, what type of a not write, not read. So this is this you're not hungry, don't eat. However, in many exactly. So I don't need high density for a period of time. It could be 3 months. It could be. There are certainly different that proving something. For instance, in the foundation, the Sci Foundation, funding a lot of early stage science, you realize how expensive it is and how long it takes. It is a long-term investment, and if you are looking to make behavioral changes or modify aspects of yourself, cognitive, physical, psycho-emotional, or otherwise, identifying a funny story associated with that didn't quite work out as planned, and I don't use it any longer. But what I experienced prior to actually finding this on forums was joint pain, elbow pain. The one most consistent side effect was what real estate and cold plunge. And it's just a cue for people don't eat anything light, and then eat 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. Okay. What's your point?
A gatherings we've been talking about in a few years on a podcast. This
is from the Jack in the Box in Mountain View, or options that people might recognize. And I would say is maybe not the greatest example. Skiing would be another one, but let's
An ally has been slain. Double kill. spree. Killing spree.
Looks can be deceiving. Eyes see me.
Rampage.
Where next?
Ally has been slain. Your turret has been destroyed. Unstoppable.
Are you certain? Summoner. I
Enemy double kill. Enemy kill.
I
Enemy has been slain.
look can be deceiving. Look can be deceiving.
Legendary. An ally has been slain.
Patience, son.
An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain.
can be deceiving.
Shut down. Slain an enemy.
Tricky, aren't you?
Has destroyed a turret.
Classic misdirection.
Now!
Ally has been slain.
There's no escape.
Ally has been slain.
Are you sick? Trust me. Tricky, aren't you?
Your team has destroyed a turret.
Try soon.
Ally has been slain. Shut down. An ally has been slain. Enemy double kill. Ace. Defeat.